Hi, I'm Sean Healy, change agent, and you're watching the Relationship Resourcing Series. Today's episode is about self-awareness in parenting. So thank you for watching today. I thought I'd do this particular episode. The series covers business relationships, it covers personal relationships, our relationship with ourselves, and from time to time I like to do an episode on helping parents, because I think this is such a demanding area. It's becoming so much more sophisticated as our understanding shifts as far as what works with child rearing psychology, what is required from parents, and what the challenges are for parents that present in modern day society in ways that parents of previous generations just simply haven't had to face. So there's a level of complexity, there's a level of sophistication that the modern parent needs to deal with. And so I thought this episode might just be something that would help you there. The key thing I sort of want to say about this particular episode and why self-awareness is so important is because children don't necessarily pay attention to what we say. They emulate what we do, and they pick up on the subtle repeated messages that that happen hundreds of times over the course of our experience raising them. And so it's really important that we become aware as parents of the things that inadvertently we might be telegraphing towards children. And why it's so challenging is because there are fundamental shifts that have happened in terms of the requirements of the modern parent compared to previous generations. So I wanted to kind of look at some of those elements, because there's whole skill sets that need to be developed now that just simply weren't there before. So I wish you well. It's a very large journey. It's about embracing our imperfection as parents, as teachers, as people responsible for supporting young people and the future generations. And so we're recognizing that we're doing the best we can, and then setting an intention to continue to improve, because you know, human beings, it's so important that we can still love and regard ourselves despite our imperfections, because that's part of being a human being, is that we're perfectly imperfect. And so this is not here to blame anyone, this is not here to make people wrong, but rather just to look at what are the areas in which we need to improve, because the more we can self-examine, the more this inadvertently supports our parenting going forward and allows it to develop and emerge. We can be more free-flowing, we can be more present with children rather than triggered by unexamined and unresolved responses from the past. So what are some of the things that we want to look at? Well, as a parent, I think it's important that we are able to look at our own childhood with a degree of balance. I sometimes meet people who have completely pedestalized their parents and have a kind of a sense of fantasy around their childhood. And this can sometimes be a psychological defense, but it doesn't serve us in getting real about what happened to us. There are elements of our childhood that no doubt were wonderful, and then there were things that were less than ideal. You know, very traumatic and challenging experiences that happened to us, and sometimes just emotional neglect, you know, the kind of support that we needed, the kind of nurture that we needed that we didn't get as children. And so when we can see and view our childhood with moderacy, and we can see both the strengths and the weaknesses of it and how that's impacted us, this begins to allow us to be more rounded parents. This allows us to begin to examine what are the core things that we want to pass on to the next generation, and making sure that we are not responding to our children through wounds, or perpetuating the cycle of experience that we had we're just kind of passing that on to the next generation rather than going, there are certain things that I'd like to stop with me. There are great things I want to pass on about my family system, but there are certain things that were less than ideal, and I want to be able to take the time to examine how I might do that differently. So we're really, and some of the moments that expose these are those moments of high distress for us. Those moments where things are not going the way we perceive them to be, where we are finding that the behaviors of our children are very triggering, or our partner, or our families, and we're taking that moment to go, what might be in this for me? What's the opportunity here for me to examine my responses and create a different kind of space going forward? Because this really can be so powerful as a way of continuing to advance ourselves and to advance our growth as human beings. It can be very tricky to be able to be emotionally present for children as consistently as possible if we grew up in a family system that did not do that well. If we grew up in a family system where mostly mum and dad were too busy or too distracted or had addiction issues or parented from their own unresolved wounds, then we don't necessarily have really good references for how to be more present, how to be more healthily vulnerable, and how to be more attuned to our own children. And so we sometimes need to surrender that we might need to get advice, we might need to get support, and that we might need to learn a new way to do things and be comfortable with not doing that perfectly straight away, because we're learning to spend more and more time. The end game is to be able, with boundaries and containment, to help foster and develop the essence and authenticity of our child or our children. And that can sometimes be challenging when that was not fostered for us, but rather we were, through varying methods, forced into a paradigm of obedience, into a paradigm of being molded to support the will of parents and to support the ideas of that present culture. Things like children should be seen and not heard. That there were certain ideologies around discipline. Certainly when I was growing up, I experienced a lot of physical abuse that was disguised as discipline. The number of times I was hit with different objects, especially by people who were responsible for my rearing, for supposed transgressions. And it's interesting to me now when I look back and I go, how often adults chose to strike me, not with their bare hand because that would have hurt them, but rather with implements. And the times when we ran in fear, a natural response as a child from somebody carrying a stick, a belt, or some other implement that they were going to quote unquote discipline us with, because apparently that was for our own good. And being forced to deny our own natural response to run from danger and comply. You can already hear in my throat the power of the distress that when I think back on, what that requires when a child needs to deny their own feelings and will in order to fit in order to be seen as obedient and compliant. And in some regards, very unintentionally, our will was squashed before we even had the chance to develop it. And I see so many adults these days in my dealings who are still trying to figure out who they are, still trying to figure out what's important and meaningful to them, because a lot of that was denied in their childhood. Like I said, this is not some intent. It's not that our parents didn't love us, but it was the ideology at the time. And, that carries a lasting legacy. We don't always remember, because some of what was inflicted on us was so young. We don't necessarily carry the conscious memory of that, but we certainly carry an embodied memory of that. And sometimes in our deepest and most triggered moments, that can come out of us and fly back towards our children. You know, what is suppressed and denied in us, we you know, under extreme stress, can sometimes find that as an opportunity to spray out, in particular on others. And we can have those moments where we recreate what was done to us. We were in the position of the victim at the time, and then we inadvertently take up the position of the abuser. We revisit that dynamic from the other side of the cycle. And so it's so important that we acknowledge with clarity some of the things that happen to us. If we need to grieve those, then we do so, and then we start to look at how do we make you know, a space of different response. You know, because what tends to work best is when we can, if we're setting gentle boundaries for children, we're able to kind of, you know, gently stop a behavior, but then we're showing what we would like to see instead, rather than don't do that, stop this, don't feel that way. Rather than going, you know, we're learning how to acknowledge emotions, we're learning how to sit, we're helping children to sit with their emotions, and then we're giving them something useful to do about that. That's a whole other episode in and of itself. But it starts by us acknowledging in ourselves what wasn't allowed. You know, the more we can get in touch with ourselves, the more aware we can become of our own authenticity, of our own feelings and what's going on for us in a moment, the better we're going to be just as parents, the more present we're going to be, the more empathic and understanding, and be able to direct from a place of healthiness rather than from a place of reactivity. We can start. It's very difficult to be present with a child when we haven't learned how to be fully present with self. So children offer a great opportunity for us to become aware of what's not resolved from our own childhood, and then we're taking responsibility for that. We're seeking help if we need it, and we're making the kinds of changes that allow us to be more present, more loving, and more validating as parents, whilst also being able to set healthy boundaries for children and direct. But it's difficult to do those things when we haven't recognized that certain things in our childhood weren't there as well as they could have been. You know, if we grew up in a family system that didn't teach boundaries very well, then we have to realize that this is a blind spot for us. How are we visiting that inadvertently on our children and those around us, and how do we start to learn to do those things better? You know, it really bears very rich fruit and reward if we can sit with, in an honest way, what our family system experience was, and what was to be cherished and embraced and adored about that experience, but at the same time also what was missing, and that we're able to acknowledge that. It's not about going back and, you know, if there's anger around boundary violations as a child, we need to process that in a healthy way ourselves. It's not about going back to family members and attacking them and how dare you do this to me. That's not going to go well for you. If we, you know, rather than, we need to process and own our own responses as adults so that we can do better for children and better for future relationships. So it's an area I'm deeply passionate about, you know, that we're learning to be more present with ourselves so that we can infer that on children, and we're able to allow children to be more present. We're not going to be triggered by them because they're doing the thing that we were denied. And we're also not going to impose, if there's certain elements of our childhood that we recognize that we didn't get, that might be about us. And so we're not going, well, I didn't get these things, so I'm going to make sure my child does. If your child is slightly different, then that might not be exactly what they want. I understand the intent behind that, but we're recognizing that that's about what we didn't get. So we're not then trying to impose that on our children, but we're able to be present and authentic with the child in front of us. And we're not trying to mold the child to some sense of our own ideal, or foster in the child what lacked in us, if that is not intuitively what the child requires, but rather we're seeing the child as their own separate entity, and we're doing what we can to foster their spirit, their nature, and help them to develop in their own authenticity, and surrender to the fact that that may not look like our ideal for them, and so that we're not attached to this sense of egoic identity as a parent, that my child is a reflection and an extension of me, but rather that my child, is their own being, and part of my role as a parent is to foster them into as much of a connection with their own innate worth, their own innate value, so that we're being really mindful that we're doing for these wonderful children the things that weren't necessarily done as well for us, so that we're fostering within the child their sense of their own innate worth, just by looking at them from time to time. We're making sure we validate children when they're not necessarily doing anything at all. They might just be sitting around, and we come past and we look at them lovingly and we say, I'm just so delighted that you're in my life. We're making sure that, we're not setting up a dynamic where the only time we reward and acknowledge children is when they've achieved something. They brought home a good grade at school, and so we put it on the board or on the fridge, and we make a cake, or they've achieved at sport, and so we've taken them out for dinner, or we're lauding them to the rest of the family, but rather that we're taking moments where children are just in their beingness, so that we're using those moments to connect with them, to acknowledge them, and to let them know how just through their being, they matter, and they're so valuable. And if we can do that, then children begin to get an understanding that they are valuable just as they are, rather than they associate praise and acknowledgement with those moments of doing and achieving. And that way we are inadvertently setting children up to associate achievement and action with value rather than beingness. So much to say about this kind of a topic. It's an enormous one, but I thought I'd just do this little snippet. I hope it gives you some insight. I hope it informs you in some way to add to your parenting. But like I said, the more aware we can be of who we are and the kinds of things that drive us as adults, the more the children and the young people will benefit from that. So I really hope that this has been something that gives you some opportunity for introspection, and helps to point you towards, how do I do better by my children, in a way that lets us just be present with ourselves, and as I say, if it brings up things where we need support, then we're making sure we're going and getting the support that we need. So again, the relationship resourcing series is about covering topics relative to the broad spectrum of our relationships, and offering insight and resource into how we can have better quality relationships. You can find me at emergencetraining.com.au if you want to have a conversation. I work with one-to-one. I do one-to-one work. I do organizational work. I run public and in-house business trainings, looking at how we can get better and more productive relational dynamics between ourselves and those around us. And if there's anything you want me to do a video on, then you're more than welcome to reach out and let me know about that too, and happy to see if I can support in any way sort of possible. So thank you again for watching this episode, and until we see you on the next one, bye for now.